Hello, everybody. Welcome to the January 10th occurrence of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so everybody please be nice. We do have an open agenda. I pasted the link in the chat here. So feel free to add any items that you want to discuss to the agenda, and we will get to those. I will also share my screen so we can be looking at the agenda, and I will try to make this a bit bigger here. Can everybody see my screen? Is that a decent size? Awesome.
Looks good.
Great. Okay, so to start off, we'll start off with a recap from last week's meeting. Oh, and please, yes, add your name to the attendees section of the agenda as well, just so we can know who's interested and mark that you came here. So as a recap from our last meeting, I mentioned that I'm working on Gamma conformance tests for the Gateway API, porting over the Istio bit, the Istio framework to Gateway API, at least the parts that make sense. That's been progressing slowly but surely. The next, Mike had brought up the idea of just wanting to see what the status is on PR 1493, and I approved it. There were some other longer standing questions. I think the consensus of the last time we talked about the PRs that we want to move forward with it. There were some questions about, does Istio need this? But John nicely commented here and said that it's less important, but they'll still likely use the consumer routing part of this. So appreciate that context, John. I'll actually add that to the notes here. So we'll still use it, just less important. So I think we are looking for a review from a couple of the Gateway API maintainers to kind of give us the go ahead. I believe, John, it might be helpful to resolve a couple of these open items, just for maybe for ease of review, since some of the context has been lost. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that might help get that review out there and we can get this merged in. Any questions on that bullet point?
Just to understand who's actually using, like who, it sounds like there's a mixed use case here where Linkerd plans to implement, but are others planning to implement as well? This specific gap?
So Istio will implement it. It's just we probably in the sidecar mode. We just probably won't implement it for a long time in the ambient mode. I'm sure eventually we'll get to adding it. But we don't think it's as important for ambient in the short term. Most routes actually are producer routes we found. So that's kind of what we're focusing on.
I think that Linkerd has seen probably more situations where people are interested in overriding consumer behavior, but yeah, I mean, that's a thing that we will be gaining more experience with fairly rapidly. So
do we know of any, I mean, that's both good to hear. Do we know of any other implementations that are interested in taking this potential part of the spec on, or I guess not spec, whatever this is?
Experiment.
This thing.
Yeah. So I'm aiming to get Cilium Service Mesh team to have a look at this now that we've started the new year. We just all got to, bandwidth, as you know. But yeah, so I would like Cilium Service Mesh to be able to do some of this at some stage in the not too distant future. But it's I use the words not too distant on purpose, though.
Okay, so I mean, one of the things we look for in many things is just that it's broadly implementable. It sounds like that's the case here. And not just implementable, but it seems like there's intent to implement. So that seems like a good sign. I know it's been a while since I've looked at this and I need to revisit, but given that Keith has already approved, I think it should just be a formality for any one of us to merge this in.
Yeah, I think so. I see you, Costin. I think the key part there is that this is an experiment. So if someone can't implement it, they try to implement it and they can't, then that is also a valuable data point. This is not a fine.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
just going to bring that up as well.
I would say it can be implemented with a sidecar model, and it is very difficult or cannot be implemented without a sidecar model, which is kind of the reason why Ambient will not implement it. And so I don't know if we want to impose a mesh requires sidecars, or we want to specify that consumer overrides are only for sidecar modes or meshes using sidecars. I don't think that's a good idea.
No, I think right now this is literally an experiment. We're going to say this. I think what we're saying is we're going to say, hey, do this, and then if people can't, then we come back and say, if I can't get Cilium to do this because we don't have a sidecar for doing that, then I'll come back and say, hey, I can't do this. I think we need to talk about this again. Like that's all. Like this is very, very early days in my mind. Sorry, John.
Yeah, I completely agree, but also a long-term path could be that this is something that's what's it called, implementation specific or something, right? Some implementations may not support it, or maybe we don't do that, but I'm just saying that's a possible future outcome too.
Last week we were particularly, and my apologies, I don't remember who was talking about this kind of from the Istio side, but there was discussion last week about the fact that it would work fine in sidecar, but not so fine in ambient. And generally the place that we left it was that everybody believed that for the purpose of advancing the experiment, it should be fine to allow that restriction to exist and to allow Istio in ambient mode to just set a status saying, hey, this consumer route is not being taken. And I agree that that's probably not ideal in the long term, but I think that for purposes of gathering actual use data and figuring out how things actually work when we try to go forward with this, it sounds fine to me.
Yeah, we do have plenty of data. I mean, Istio does support consumer overrides in sidecar mode, and there is a lot of experience and pain associated with that. That's a different story. But I think there is another kind of path forward, which is kind of a middle ground where we may support some subset of consumer override or some sort of variation which can be implemented with waypoints, with regular gateways, where we take into account the client and we apply different routes so it may be possible to implement a subset of it with ambient or without sidecars. And I suspect when we start implementing egress, because egress is mostly about client overrides effectively, that's when we can kind of find some common ground between egress and what we can do for mesh use cases for consumer specific settings.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what you said, and I think you've raised some good points. But I think that I think this is the best we got for now, and I think at this point it's more important that we keep some momentum and we keep some things actually happening here, and we try not to get too stuck, because I think at this point we have done enough talking about this that it is more valuable to have implementation data than it is to be too worried about what happens here, as long as we're all clear about how experimental this is, which I feel like I have labored that point enough, so I'll stop.
If it makes you feel any better, Nick, it came up quite a lot last week as well.
All right, so sounds like we've got a path forward on this bullet point. So moving on through the recap, we talked a good bit last week about goals from goals in the new year. Not everybody could make it. It was, after all, kind of the first day back from many of our holiday breaks. But kind of talked about our wish lists for this year for Gamma, which was very awesome. Flynn mentioned that Linkerd, he helps Linkerd gets to a point where they're able to decide, if it's going to be feasible for their use cases, implementing Gamma, that is. I mentioned that policy would be great to start fleshing out. Still a lot of open field there. Console wants to have Gamma support by year's end. I believe Mike said that. Kuhn wants to play with it more. We had a whole aside on whole interesting aside, I'll say, about multi-cluster and some of the some hesitations, I'll use that term, towards implementation.
Good word.
Yeah, towards implementing the MCS API specifically, and patterns that many of us have observed in the wild with like a hub and spoke kind of pattern for configuration management in multi-cluster, where how the MCS API kind of falls short in some of those areas. Questions about the status of the MCS API. It is still currently in alpha according to the GitHub page. And I mentioned kind of my hope for this year. Even if we don't write a single word in a gap towards multi-cluster, I want to at least try to bridge the gap between us over here in networking and the SIG multi-cluster. It feels like there, at least from my POV, because of the need for there to be an MCS controller and many projects reluctance to become an MCS controller, we've got this long feedback loop problem where it's taking so long to get MCS controllers out there, get people playing with the MCS API, that we haven't really gotten clear signals here. And so I'd love to see what we can do from an organizational perspective to maybe shorten that feedback loop again and get SIG multi-cluster some insight here. So we talked about that multi-cluster.
I'll just since
go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I've got lots of things to say about multi-cluster. I agree. It's unfortunate that it has it has stuck in alpha for quite a while now. I know at least from GKE side, we are very interested in pushing this forward and trying to do what we can to help move it towards GA. I know from me, I'm very much gateway focused, and I've been trying to formalize what multi-cluster gateway even looks like. I know there is at least one implementation available and others on the way. And I would love to make sure that what we're all working on is actually consistent, because it's not really well defined right now. So those are things that are very much top of mind for me. I would, as always, help is welcome with these things. But my goal is in the next month or two to have some kind of PR out that defines what multi-cluster gateway means, what the interaction between gateway API and multi-cluster services. And then finally, this is not something that I personally will be leading, but I am definitely talking with people that will be helping with the multi-cluster service API. And hopefully, again, if anyone is interested, this is an area where we really need different implementations of the API, different interested parties to be involved. With Gateway, we've been really fortunate in that we've had a lot of implementations that can help us meet criteria for graduating. With multi-cluster service, there's not quite as many implementations today. So it would be helpful to get whatever perspective we can from as many different perspectives as possible. So that's my view of multi-cluster service, but very much top of mind for me going into this year.
Definitely something we're interested in from the console side too. It feels like it just it stabilized earlier than I think a lot of our users and customers we're starting to get to, like, the actual problem that's intended to solve. So I think that is a bit of an explanation for why it seems to have not moved as actively, perhaps. We're definitely seeing interest in that subject area now. So yeah, we're definitely going to be looking at this and interested particularly I think they've mentioned wanting to learn from Gateway API and work on conformance tests for MCS, things like that. So
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of stuff there that I would certainly like to learn more about as well.
Yeah, likewise. So hopefully we can make some progress on that here in the new year. I'm excited about that. I added a new topic here as far as wish lists around operations. I was talking to who was it I was talking to? I forget. Well, I think it was some of the STO folks about we've had conversations here in Gamma about the idea of representing certain mesh operations within the API. Things like enrolling a workload into the mesh, doing that with a resource or so, or should it all just be transparent? Should there be a standard way? I think, John, you and I was around for a conversation we were having about something in the ambient world with operations, and someone asked if there is a standard way of doing that. Do you have any more context on that?
I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but I can give some insight on how ambient works. So Istio sidecar is like, I think the rest of Mesh's label on the namespace. For ambient, there's kind of two parts. One is whether you're capturing the L4 traffic, and the other is actually deploying these waypoint proxies. So whether things are captured on the L4 perspective, that's a label on the namespace today. For waypoints, we're actually deploying them with the Gateway API. With its own gateway class that's called like Istio Waypoint or something. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think the direction I was going, I found it now. You asked a question in the Gateway API Slack channel about things like upgrades or customizations and resource requests within the Gateway API. In my brain, I was classifying that as operations.
Oh yeah, I mean that would be useful for us for one, just normal ingress gateways. But also waypoints, because they're also represented as gateways and they're also deployments in the cluster. So anything that's, a gateway creates a deployment, we have potential to want to upgrade those resources, et cetera. But that's, well, I guess even for mesh, you may want to configure the sidecar. So I suppose it's similar. But for us, we've already solved those problems for sidecars. Whereas we haven't solved the problem of, oh, now we have a gateway that deploys a deployment, rather than like a Helm chart that had all these customizations. But I could see, there could be a world where there's a mesh and it has whatever customizations you have and whatnot.
One point I want to make is, at least for ambient and also I suspect for other kind of mesh implementations, in general, because it's operating at node level and because it's capturing all traffic, it's not very friendly to multiple meshes, what we discussed in the past, because really it's very difficult to have a per node component that it's interacting with CNI and capture all the traffic, and then for some pods it's splitting. It becomes extremely complicated, and it's also kind of difficult to say that one node has mesh, another node doesn't have mesh. So all that remains is really ability to opt out or opt in some workloads, which again is highly debatable, because in CNI you cannot opt out some workloads to use WireGuard or IPsec and some workloads to not use it. It's kind of a general CNI option. So I suspect the use case for having some workload select a mesh or be mesh enabled or be mesh disabled is it becomes a bit difficult to justify and to find a common, because I suspect other meshes will have the same kind of, hey, the mesh is on by default to make it easy, so we don't have a user having to worry about the mesh. So maybe we should postpone it until we have more feedback, both on ambient and other meshes that want to be on by default.
Got it. So yeah, this is something that just based on Slack and other conversations that I didn't know other folks had thoughts on. Do any non-Istio meshes representatives have any opinions on this operations direction?
I think, yeah, I think that there's definitely going to be, for Cilium, right? Like there's no real way to opt in or out, right? Like you opt in or out on a cluster level because it's the CNI. So like it's less meaningful for us. Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean that there can't be ways to handle it for people who can opt in or out. And so but again, I agree with Costin that I think we really just need more implementation experience. I think going too far down this thing is just runs the risk of that we're locking in things that we're going to have to change later. So yeah, I think it's a bit risky is to go too far on those. Yeah, I think maybe something to opt out maybe, but yeah, that may be like I would like to see so anytime anyone says a label or an annotation, anything to do with Gateway API, I have a visceral reaction where I say no. So I think that like I would much rather see those things that any setting that we have that's controllable be in a structured field somewhere. So annotations annotations and labels are like a nice escape valve, but like I would be very upset if we ended up with that for something as important as this.
Yeah,
What was,
perfectly fine.
what was that? I think I've heard you say before, Nick, something like root of all evil or something like that. Looking over this one, I think it actually might be more important to have a way to opt out ports than a way to opt out specific pods. There are definitely cases where, for example, there are cases in Linkerd land where it becomes very important to be able to tell Linkerd the ingress is meshed. Please do not even look at incoming traffic coming from outside of the cluster into the ingress, because if Linkerd does look at it, then it becomes correspondingly more difficult to preserve the original source IP. And so that's an immediate operational concern that I think is going to end up being important in a shorter term than otherwise. I don't think it's something we need right this second. I just think it's a thing that's going to rear its head quicker than the ability to say, oh yeah, this workload doesn't belong in the mesh at all.
And in any case, I mean, it's not like we suffer from a lack of other directions to explore. So yeah, that sounds perfectly fine. Just wanted to get folks' POV on it, and hey, I'm happy to defer things. We've got a lot of other things to talk about.
One more thing here. I mean, I think for this particular thing about port exclude in particular, it will be very useful. Okay, not CRD, but some place in the API to specify ports to exclude. So a user who is implementing proxyless gRPC, for example, doesn't have to figure out for each mesh implementation what they need to do. I mean, it is a label. I know you don't like labels, but that's what we have. It's an annotation. But I'm sure each vendor will have something to allow opt-out for a particular port. And it will be very painful for users to at least for proxyless gRPC to deploy stuff across multiple meshes. And probably they'll just support Istio and someone else, and the rest will be a pain.
Yep.
Lee Win, I see you have a question in the chat about metrics. Could you explain some more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, the reason, we're talking about operation, right? Many times the operation is, one of the key factor, thing of operation is metrics. So my question is, are we going to standardize our metrics regarding the gateway objects, or we just rely on existing data plane, like SDO, you have SDO metrics, every data plane has their own metrics or Envoy metrics, or we commonize them into a gateway metrics? That's my question.
I know that's a really good question, and I know that has come up before in an issue, and I think the response to the issue at that time is it's a great idea, but we just don't have time to take it on. Trying to, Gateway API already has a massive scope, so it was a not a no, but a not yet answer at the time. We can reevaluate that, but right now we have so much going on I'm tempted to say not yet is probably still the right answer.
The folks in chat saying relying, punting to open telemetry. We still end up, there's still a question of naming doing that, right?
They define some names. Part of the open telemetry is the semantic conventions, which defines name for HTTP metrics and attempt to standardize across telemetry vendors what metric names and dimensions to be used. And I think the answer should not be that is not in scope for, which clearly should not be our problem here. There's enough duplication in telemetry about each vendor defining its own metrics. Let's give open telemetry a chance to succeed.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. I think there is a lot that we as a field are experimenting with when it comes to what does a metric specification look like. Open telemetry does come, is the best I've seen in this space, at least so far. And I am very invested, probably I'm very optimistic about its ability to succeed where other things like SMI traffic metrics have failed. Even when it comes to naming, it would be great to have standard names and shapes. I use shapes as a loose collection depending on what your metric system is. But to the point of some of the folks in chat, I think Costin's point in chat, like cardinality starts becoming an issue depending on the shape of certain things. And now you've got to start designing for certain cardinality and certain use cases. And just to take an example that's close to the folks here, if you look at ingress versus mesh in cardinality, what might be a good shape for ingress now it might be untenable for mesh because you've got that n squared problem. And the
slightly different,
just slightly different. And these are proxies doing largely the same job but in different contexts. And to Rob's point, we've got a lot of things to take a look at, but I don't even know for me personally, if I need to do a lot more research on metric storage and things like that first.
I'd be fine with, pointing people towards open telemetry. Hey, we think OpenTel is probably a reasonable idea, but yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, well, that's been a very fruitful recap. Any other last second comments on our recap so far? All right, fantastic. So this will be hopefully, crossing fingers, quick agenda item here. As far as Gamma supportability, I planned to bring this up in the Gateway API meeting yesterday, but had a last second conflict and couldn't make it. It's on the schedule for next week, but I wanted to, well, actually next week, did they decide to cancel it, Rob and Nick?
It will exist, but it will not have an agenda per se. We expect light attendance, but anyone is always welcome.
Got it.
I'll run the meeting. I expect it to be a office hoursy, let's have a chat kind of thing, rather than we're going to make serious decisions kind of thing.
Got it. So, hey, this is as good a time as any to talk about Gamma supportability. So, with our goal of trying to get the first Gamma release out in Gateway API 0.7.0, it makes sense to me to try to make sure we get our naming right when it comes to the supportability and conformance levels of Gamma and what it is within Gateway API. The best that I've come up with is here in the agenda that Gamma is a provisional like a series of, at the moment, provisional GEPs in the experimental channel that have some parts of its spec that have core conformance, which is a little bit of a weird mental model, at least for me. But I think of things like, our HTTP routes API. If you want to implement Gamma, I don't see the way you implement Gamma without doing the supporting HTTP route in the way that the GEP is specified. So in a sense, that that's part of core conformance for mesh. But so far, those directions are being powered by provisional GEPs, and everything that Gamma is within the experimental channel. I wanted to see if that is the direction we want to go. Broadly asking the Gateway API maintainers here, and to see if there's any communications or clarifications around supportability, conformance, et cetera, that might need to be made for Gamma for 070.
I mean, I think in terms of like what we've talked about so far, route binding to service is one of those things where the spec does not stop you from doing that right now, right? Like there's nothing in the spec that says you can't do that. There's nothing in, so like it's just implementation specific behavior. So like that, I think that being a provisional GEP is fine because it doesn't actually need spec changes. And as long as we do stuff where, as long as most of the other stuff we do doesn't add fields or sort of, do other sort of API changey kind of things, then all Gamma is a series of provisional GEPs that are implementation specific support. And so that's fine, right? Like it's more, if we want to start adding conformance tests, that becomes a little bit more complicated because then it's like, we're kind of adding conformance tests for implementation specific behavior, which we don't generally do because that makes it extended. That doesn't mean that we can't do it. It just means that if we are, I think once we start talking about adding conformance tests, that's when we sort of need to be clear about what's the story about these conformance tests, and do we add them as like a separate set of conformance, like a separate suite, maybe, because we have the sort of the suite level functionality, and we add a Gamma suite that you can then run in addition to the sort of the Ingress suite. That seems like a reasonably clear way to do this, and say, hey, this is the Gamma suite is completely experimental, and is not required for any level of conformance. It's there to sort of for us to coordinate on developing conformance tests for Gamma behaviors, or something like that. If and when we start adding fields or changing the behavior of fields or adding values to fields or doing any of that stuff, that's when that stuff goes in the experimental channel like everything else and needs to be clearly declared as being experimental. I think that's those are my feelings.
So I can add a little bit of context to this. One of the specific cases that prompted this discussion initially was John's open PR for client-side routing, as opposed, so that's like service consumer routing at like, or like egress routing, as opposed to like service owner producer routing. That's something that felt like it would be appropriate to if you choose to implement this, it should behave in this way. So basically like our extended spec or our extended conformance level versus the producer defined routing that exists currently in the provisional GEP experimental channel, which felt like core functionality for Gamma. So it's almost like we kind of want a different axis for Gamma to have its own conformance levels, because we know that or the same levels, but just in the Gamma column, just kind of standardize that, because we know that like there's going to be ingress only implementations of Gateway API that won't have any of this, and that's where it feels inappropriate to introduce any Gamma concepts in an extended or core, maybe not extended, but at least core, and being able to differentiate. I
think the thing that's relevant is we don't talk about it a lot, but like, the things that are currently experimental in the Ingress Gateway API have extended conformance, right? So, so they already have extended conformance. So we have experimental things that have extended conformance. We don't promote those to beta until they have conformance tests, right? And so I think it feels to me like the sort of the canonical place where we're really recording how there's two canonical places where we record if things are extended or core or whatever. That's on the field itself, but for behavior that sort of crosses fields or isn't specified in a single field, then it's the conformance tests. And so that's where I think us saying, hey, Gamma gets its own suite, is a good way to sort of keep that as an orthogonal concern largely, because it's a bit nuanced as to like, as long as we're not talking about specific fields. I think talking about specific fields is much more complicated because we need to be like, hey, this field is standard in in Ingress, but is experimental in Gamma. All right, like that is a complicated conversation. But I think the good part is that right now we are all the experimental stuff we're doing is explicitly trying not to add fields. So this should be a problem for future us when we do want to add a field. Sorry, Rob.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I just wanted to bring in a few other concepts we've talked about before. One, I think, Nick, I think you're the one who had this idea previously, that of conformance profiles. The idea that, we've thought a lot about, there are going to be L4 implementations of this API still on the Ingress level, but they're not going to support HTTP route, more than likely, right? Similar for L7 only implementations of the API. And that doesn't even start to get into Gamma, but the idea that we could define common conformance profiles, or again, I'm not sure exactly what this looks like, but this all comes back to that discussion that we had yesterday for anyone on the main meeting yesterday about the idea that we want gateway classes to be able to describe the features they support in a meaningful way. And the schema for how they do that could be very helpful in defining so much else, right? Defining a table at some point somewhere that says this gateway class, this implementation supports these features, and we have a clearly defined idea of what that feature means, right? I don't know. I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion, but I very, very much want to see this go forward because I know we are rapidly growing out of the system our conformance tests currently support. And as part of, I think, is it John, whoever's leading the effort towards Gamma conformance, this feels like beyond just figuring out how to do tests, it's also how do we represent conformance levels. I hope we can use many of the same patterns we're already using, but we probably need one extra layer of something. I don't know.
That makes sense. The thing that so as far as gateway API and Gamma, that all makes sense and sounds like it's largely a problem for future us, like you said. I'll get to that later. I want to zero in on something though, because what you described, being able to have gateway class describe the thing it's able to do, is a very useful capability that all Kubernetes could use. I was just having a internal chat with like Cal about this the other day, in that like Kubernetes as a orchestrator can't say, oh no, I can't do this request because the things in my cluster don't have this capability. Is there any? I mean, I think gateway class is a great place to start that work. It would be fantastic if that schema could be general enough to be used elsewhere. I know that's a ton of scope. That's a giant amount of scope, but did want to call that out because that definitely be on my wish list. Don't know about anybody else.
You could call the schema Skynet.
Oh, and it even has a lovely alliteration, the Skynet schema.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure.
I feel like there's a tiny bit of overlap here. I don't know if anyone saw the doc that Tim sent out yesterday about rethinking alpha, beta, and GA. And one of the bits of that was trying to provide a better UX around using alpha features or beta features.
Feature gates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems related. The idea of providing a way to opt into things, but also to communicate that these things are experimental, may not be supported. Maybe there's a way we can tie in there. I'm not sure. I definitely agree with that longer term goal. I know, Cal definitely brought that up earlier as well in the context of Gateway API when we described this idea to him. I don't know. I'm torn between that. I want to get something out, and I want to solve the bigger picture item as well. So my best guess is we have to start relatively small, but as long as we have a path to a better solution that's Kubernetes wide, I think that's good directionally.
And I think that there's some value in us having a crack at doing something to provide data for the Kubernetes wide efforts as to what works and what doesn't as well.
I
Given
think
that
there's
it's much
probably quite a
easier-
bit of value in that, actually.
Yeah, given that it's much easier for us to do things, given that we're a CRD rather than a core resource that needs feature gates and a bunch of blah blah blah. It's much easier for us to sort of have a crack at doing something like this. I mean, it has been my dream. I think I spoke about this yesterday, but it has been my dream for a long time that it feels to me like the ideal way for conformance to work is that all of our conformance tests currently have require a gateway class to be installed, and you need to tell the conformance test what gateway class it is. In my dream world, that way gateway class tells you all of the features that you need to test and all of the things that you need to do, and then your the conformance tests test the features that your gateway class says it wants to test and provide you a report that says, here's the features I was told to test, here's the features that passed, and then that is a really easily machine parsable thing that we can put somewhere and then generate all of the stuff that we were talking about the other day. I think we talked a little bit about how it would be really nice to have a implementation table that says implementation, here's what it supports. And the way to make that people neutral and not A, not require manual updating, but also B, be like fair to everybody, is that thing reflects, if you get a checkbox, that means that you passed a test or a suite of tests. And that makes it fair for everybody that, hey, if your thing doesn't work, then you either need to fix your thing or fix the tests to make it work, right? Like, and that way everybody, it's the same for everybody. It's 100% fair. It's machine fair. And we also get this documentation of what everything could do. And, you get the UX of a bunch of stuff. And so that's been my dream for a long time. I think I communicated it poorly to start with, but I think this problem is an isomer of the same problem. I'll teach some chemical terms for a minute.
Yeah, that all sounds great to me. It'll be regardless on if the wider problem is solved first or gateway class is solved first. I sounds like gateway class is probably the quickest way to get some things out there for people. But I'm looking forward to seeing how getting some user feedback from that one, because that would be super exciting to have that kind of capability anywhere in Kubernetes, even if it starts here first. Okay, that is all I had on the Gamma's portability topic.
What should we summarize about that in the minutes? I feel like there's a
Good question.
It feels like there's a general consensus around, wow, it would be really cool to have capabilities, at least in the gateway class. Maybe we can start this. That
sounds like a good summary.
Yeah.
Yes. And that conformance for Gamma is complicated because of the interaction with the API resources. But for now, a separate conformance suite will cover most of the stuff that we need, is my opinion.
The moment I feel like people are watching, my typing goes to hell in a handbasket.
I believe that happens to everybody.
I'd
Yep.
say you're describing myself. You're describing me.
I'm in this picture and I don't like it. Yeah.
I didn't say I thought it was unique to me. It's just always funny after so many years.
Okay, that is the entire agenda that I have. Does anybody else have any last minute topics I'd like to discuss? Okay. It sounds like I take that silence to mean no. So I can give everybody about 10 minutes back. Thank you as always for coming to these meetings and participating. Next week, our meeting will be on Tuesday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. I'll be looking for some other topics, but Flynn, you mentioned in the past having some feedback about the HTTP route GEP. Are we getting close to having that at a discussion, a point where we can discuss about it?
Maybe in a couple of weeks is
Okay.
what I'm thinking. Yeah. So, fingers crossed there. Engineering are busily working away with some stuff. I need to finish some training certification stuff that I'm doing, and then I'll have a chance to put a little bit more bandwidth on that as well, I hope. So yeah, in another couple of weeks, I'm hoping we can have, I don't know, let's just say early February and bake a little bit of buffer into there to be able to talk a little bit more meaningfully about that.
All right, that sounds good. In the meantime, we'll go through our 070 release checklist for Gamma and talk through any remaining action items.
Cool.
All right, thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Bye.
Yep.